On the afternoon of Whit Monday, the 26th of May, 1828, a boy appeared in the city of Nuremberg in Bavaria, in the south of Germany. Nobody saw him arrive. He was simply there, in the streets near a square called the Unschlitt, a boy of perhaps 16, in clothes that didn't fit him and shoes with holes worn through. And he was walking, but only just. He walked the way a small child walks, or the way a man walks after a long illness. Stiffly, unsteadily, placing each foot as though he wasn't entirely sure the ground would be there. People watching him got the strong, strange impression that he had almost never walked at all. He was holding 2 letters. When a shoemaker named Weichmann approached him and tried to talk to him, the boy could barely answer. He didn't seem to understand most of what was said, and when he did speak, he mostly said the same thing, over and over, a single sentence, rehearsed and worn smooth, that he wanted to be a cavalryman, a soldier on horseback as his father had been. Beyond that, almost nothing. He'd point, and he'd say the word for horse. They took him to the cavalry captain the letters were addressed to. They tried to make sense of him. And slowly, over the days that followed, they realized that the boy in front of them didn't know the ordinary things that every person knows. He didn't understand fire and reached for a candle flame like a curious infant. He couldn't tell you the name of the city or the country or the year. He could write 2 words, his own name, Kaspar Hauser, but he couldn't really read. And when they finally coaxed from him where he had come from, the answer was one of the strangest a human being has ever given. He said he had spent his whole life, his entire life, as far back as he could remember, alone, in a small, dark cell. The story Kaspar told, once he had enough words to tell it, went like this. For as long as he could remember, he'd lived in a space so small he could barely stand in it, in near total darkness. He'd never seen the sky. He'd never seen another human face, not clearly. He slept on straw. Each day, bread and water were left for him. Sometimes the water tasted bitter, and when it did, he'd fall into a deep sleep and wake to find his hair and his nails had been cut and his straw changed, so that even the person who kept him, he never actually saw. The only things he had, in the dark, were 2 little horses carved out of wood. He played with them. They were his whole world. And then, near the end, he couldn't say how long ago, a man had come. A man he never saw properly. And the man had taught him a few things, quickly and roughly. How to stand, how to take a few steps, how to write those 2 words, his name. And then the man had taken him out of the cell and brought him, somehow, to the edge of Nuremberg and left him there, with 2 letters and a rehearsed sentence about wanting to be a soldier, and walked away. That was the story, and Nuremberg and then Europe was electrified by it. Because if it was true, it was monstrous. Here was a boy who had been stolen from the world as an infant and kept in a box for 16 years, robbed of language, of daylight, of every ordinary human thing, and then simply let go, like a bird out of a cage, into a city he had no way to understand. The town took him in, it formally made him its ward, and he was placed in the care of a schoolmaster and scholar named Georg Friedrich Daumer, who took on the job of teaching him and of studying him, because Kaspar Hauser was, to the thinkers of the day, an extraordinary natural experiment. What is a human being with almost everything stripped away? What's left? And Kaspar, under Daumer's roof, began to bloom. He learned to speak quickly. He learned to read and to write. He turned out to have a real gift for drawing. And he had, people noticed, uncanny senses. He could see in near darkness where others were blind. He could tell things apart by smell that no one else could, and strong tastes and lights overwhelmed him completely. At first, he could stomach nothing but bread and water. Anything else made him ill. All of it seemed to fit the story. All of it seemed to be the mark left on a body by 16 years in the dark. He became famous, one of the most famous people in Europe. Visitors came to see him, scholars wrote about him, and around him grew a rumour, a beautiful, terrible rumour, that explained everything. The rumour was that Kaspar Hauser was a prince. More precisely, that he was the stolen heir to the throne of the Grand Duchy of Baden. The story went that the baby Prince of Baden, born in 1812, had not really died in infancy, as the record said. That he had been swapped, a healthy royal baby exchanged for a dying commoner's child, by a scheming noblewoman, the Countess of Hochberg, so that her own sons would inherit the throne instead. And that the stolen prince had been hidden away, kept alive but buried in secret for 16 years, until he surfaced, ruined and speechless as the boy in the Nuremberg square. It's a perfect story. It has a wicked countess, a stolen crown, an innocent victim. One of Kaspar's most important champions, a senior and respected jurist named von Feuerbach, took the theory seriously and gave it his authority. And it turned Kaspar Hauser from a pitiable foundling into the lost prince of a fairy tale. But not everyone was convinced, and the people who spent the most time with Kaspar day to day began to notice things that didn't fit. The first thing was the letters. The 2 letters he'd been carrying when he appeared, one supposedly from the man who'd raised him, one supposedly from his mother. When people examined the handwriting, they came to an uncomfortable conclusion. Both letters seemed to be written by the same hand, and that hand might well have been Kaspar's own. And then there were the attacks. In October of 1829, about a year and a half after he'd appeared, Kaspar was found bleeding from a wound to his forehead in the cellar of Daumer's house. He said a hooded man had attacked him with a blade and had said to him, in effect, "You still have to die before you leave the city of Nuremberg." It seemed to confirm everything. The people who'd hidden him were still out there, still hunting him, trying to finish the job. But it had happened, awkwardly, just after Kaspar had quarrelled with the Daumer household over accusations that he'd been caught lying. And the skeptics had a simpler, colder explanation. That Kaspar had cut himself and hidden and invented the hooded man to turn suspicion back into sympathy. Then, a few months later, a pistol went off in his room at another house where he was staying. Kaspar said he'd fallen from a chair reaching for some books and accidentally grabbed a loaded pistol off the wall. The wound was barely a scratch, and the lady of that house began to speak openly about what she called his talent for dissimulation, his gift for performance. A wealthy and eccentric British nobleman, Lord Stanhope, swept in around this time, took an expensive interest in Kaspar, funded him, promised to take him to England, and even took him twice to Hungary to see if the sight of the place would unlock some buried memory. It didn't. Kaspar recognised nothing, and Stanhope, who had believed, stopped believing. He arranged for Kaspar to be moved to the town of Ansbach, into the care of a strict schoolmaster named Meyer, and he withdrew. By 1833, the shine had come off. Kaspar was in Ansbach, working as a copyist in a law office, unhappy, still waiting for the trip to England that never came. His great champion von Feuerbach died that May. And it later emerged that even von Feuerbach in private had scrawled a note calling Kaspar a smart scheming codger, a rogue, a good-for-nothing. The Lost Prince was becoming, in the eyes of the people around him, something much more ordinary and much more difficult. A troubled young man who told stories. And then, in December, the story ended the way the tombstone would remember it. On the 9th of December 1833, Kaspar had a serious argument with his guardian Meyer. 5 days later, on the 14th of December, he staggered home with a deep stab wound in his chest. He gasped out that a stranger had met him in the Ansbach court garden, the Hofgarten, in the snow, had handed him a purse and had stabbed him. He begged them to go and look. They went. And in the snow of the court garden, they found a small violet purse. Inside was a note. And the note was written in mirror writing, reversed so you'd need a mirror to read it easily. And it hinted at who the killer was, giving a set of initials. But when they studied the note, the same cold pattern appeared that had appeared with the very first letters 5 years before. The spelling and the grammar had the same errors that ran through Kaspar's own writing, and the paper had been folded into a distinctive triangular shape, the exact way Kaspar folded his own letters. Kaspar Hauser died of the wound 3 days later on the 17th of December, 1833. He was about 21 years old. They buried him in Ansbach under a stone that reads in Latin, "Here lies Kaspar Hauser, riddle of his time. His birth was unknown, his death mysterious." And in the court garden where he was stabbed, a monument says, "Here a mysterious one was killed in a mysterious manner." And for almost 200 years, that was exactly right. The riddle held. Was he a stolen prince, murdered to protect a crown, or a gifted damaged imposter who wrote his own letters, staged his own attacks, and finally staged a wound that cut too deep? People argued it for generations. Werner Herzog made a famous film about him. Books stacked up, and the two answers sat side by side, and neither could win. Until quietly, in our own time, science walked in and began to take the fairy tale apart. In 1996, blood from Kaspar's old clothing was tested and compared against the royal family of Baden, and the blood didn't match. Whoever Kaspar Hauser was, the DNA said, he was almost certainly not the stolen prince. The result was debated, re-examined, complicated by questions of which sample was which, but in 2024 a newer and far more powerful genetic study settled it. The mitochondrial DNA from all the Kaspar Hauser samples matched each other, but did not match the maternal line of the House of Baden. The prince theory, the beautiful centre of the whole legend, was ruled out. And there was one more finding, small and quiet and devastating. In 2023, researchers identified marks on Kaspar's body consistent with a cowpox vaccination, the smallpox inoculation. In Bavaria, that vaccination had been compulsory since 1807, and giving it to a child meant an adult had to bring that child in to be vaccinated, which is very, very hard to square with a boy who spent his entire life, from infancy, sealed alone in a lightless cell. The science doesn't prove he was a fraud. It can't tell us who he really was, or where he came from, or who, if anyone, put a knife in him in the snow. But it has, gently and firmly, closed the door on the lost prince, and it has left, in place of the fairy tale, something quieter and much sadder. So there are really three ways to hold Kaspar Hauser now. The first is the old romantic one, the genuine victim, the stolen prince, kept in the dark and murdered for a crown. It's the version that made him immortal, and it's the version modern DNA has, as gently as science ever does anything, ruled out. The second is the gifted imposter, a troubled young man of ordinary unknown origin who invented a story so vivid he may have half believed it himself, who wrote his own letters, staged his own wounds, and finally staged one that killed him. The handwriting points that way, the pattern of the attacks points that way, the science points that way, and the third is the honest one, which is that it's probably some braid of the two and we still don't fully know. That he may have been a real neglected, damaged child, not sealed in a cell, but hurt in some way we can't now trace, who wrapped his real damage in an invented legend and lived inside it, and died inside it, and took the truth with him into the snow. Whether that final wound was murder or his own hand gone too far, even the forensics can't say for certain. We know more now than any of the people who buried him ever did. We know he almost certainly wasn't the Prince of Baden. We know the sealed cell story can't be quite true. We can read the same anxious errors in the killer's note that ran through the boy's own letters. The fairy tale, piece by piece, has come apart in careful hands. And what it leaves behind isn't a prince, and it isn't quite a fraud. It's a young man who appeared from nowhere, unable to walk, clutching 2 wooden horses worth of a story, who was famous and studied and adored and doubted, who was never really known by anyone, and who died at 21 in the snow with a riddle folded into a violet purse. Was he a stolen heir, killed to keep a crown? Was he a lonely, gifted liar who wrote his own beginning and his own end? Or was he simply a hurt and unhappy person who found that a mystery was the only thing that ever made the world pay him any attention, and who couldn't, in the end, put it down? The science took the crown off him. It never did give him back his name.